Hampi Vijayanagara, the ruined city. For over 300 years, the capital of the greatest medieval empire to ever rule over South India. Its ruins extend over 25 square kilometers along a rocky landscape carved over millions of years by the mighty Tungabhadra river. Archaeologists have barely scratched the surface of this enormous and still very mysterious site, uncovering dozens of temples, palaces, and ceremonial structures. Innumerable legends are told of the subterranean temples of Hampi and their secret libraries, whose key is known only to a handful of initiates in each generation. In this video, we will be exploring some of the mysteries of this ancient city through its greatest monuments, many of which appear to have been constructed on top of the remnants of far earlier megalithic structures. We will be looking for the evidence of a lost ancient science and the ancient technologies used for carving and transporting hundreds of thousands of megalithic stone blocks. In 1336, the king Hazara I of the Sangama dynasty chose the village of Hampi in central Karnataka as the seat of an empire that had already brought much of southern India under its control and was now challenging the armies of the mighty Delhi Sultanate in the north. Hampi, a small village hidden among towering granite hills inside a bend of the Tungabhadra river, hardly seemed a site suitable for a great city. Yet the Sangama brothers Hazara I and Bukka chose it for the construction of their new imperial capital, a city which they called Vijayanagara, the city of victory. According to legend, the two brothers were hunting along the Tungabhadra river when a hare, instead of running from its chasers, suddenly turned upon their hounds, causing them to flee. The Sangama brothers took this as an auspicious sign. Like the hare who turned upon the hounds, they turned on the forces of the Muslim Delhi Sultanate, almost succeeding at chasing them entirely out of South India. Under the rule of the subsequent kings of the Sangama dynasty, Vijayanagara prospered, sitting at the head of an empire that now stretched from the Gulf of Bengal to the Arabian Sea. The immense wealth of this vast territory was diverted toward the great city of Vijayanagara, which grew from a humble village into an unrivaled showpiece of imperial splendor. At its peak, Vijayanagara may have been home to a population of nearly 1 million, at a time when Paris, then Europe's largest city, barely reached 200,000. It contained hundreds of temples, markets, palaces, colonnade avenues, and great fortified compounds to house the city's rich and powerful. Yet all these did not last. By the early 16th century, dynastic struggles and a series of disastrous military campaigns had reduced the Vijayanagara Empire to a shadow of its former glory. In January of 1565, the Vijayanagara army was vanquished by a coalition of the Deccan sultans. The last king, Rama Raya, was killed in combat, and the city abandoned to months of pillaging and looting by the enemy forces. So thorough was the devastation that Vijayanagara never recovered. In spite of the attempts by later kings to reconquer their former empire and move again their court into the city, Vijayanagara fell even farther into ruins. By the early 19th century, it lay almost entirely forgotten, when its ruins were visited and explored by several British travelers, who left melancholic descriptions of its once glorious temples, now wholly swallowed by vegetation and inhabited only by wild beasts. It is with similar feelings that we approach today the exploration of this great ruined city. The immensity of the site makes it impossible to explore it in any straightforward manner, forcing the modern visitor into an almost circular itinerary. The site of Hampi, located on the western bank of the Tungabhadra river in central Karnataka, may be conveniently divided into two major sectors, called the Sacred Center and the Royal Center, plus dozens of isolated temples and monuments still located within the walls of the ancient city. The Sacred Center is home to Hampi's most important and only still functioning temple, called the Virupaksha temple. The Royal Center, on the other hand, consists of several walled enclosures that once contained the royal palaces and the main administrative buildings of the city. Outside of these, other important monuments include the Vittala temple complex, Patabhirama, Raghunatha, and Achyutaraya temples, each contained within their own walled enclosures. Completing the circuit of the city are nearly 32 kilometers of walls, containing hundreds of towers and at least 14 major fortified gates. The sacred sector of the ancient city is dominated by the two granite hills of Hemakuta and Matanga, which both offer spectacular views of the ruined temples and the Tungabhadra river below. Past the megalithic enclosure wall, a ruined entrance pavilion leads into the sacred sector and the first group of temples on Hemakuta Hill. These temples, dramatically disposed on a sloping shelf of granite overlooking the great Virupaksha temple, are some of the earliest at the site and some of the finest examples of pre- and early Vijayanagara period architecture. They possess mostly undecorated exteriors, with single or double cells surmounted by pyramidal towers. The interiors, on the other hand, display very ornate pillars, mimicking in architectural form the aspect of the earlier Hindu and Buddhist rock-cut temples. A broad path, flanked by monumental gateways and smaller shrines, leads from Hemakuta Hill to the huge enclosure of the Virupaksha temple below. This was the greatest and the most important of the Vijayanagara temples, constantly enriched and enlarged by the kings of the Sangama dynasty. Access to the temple is by means of an enormous entrance gopura, rising more than 50 meters into the air and facing the Great Bazaar Street. The walls of the temple are of granite, formed of huge stone blocks laid without mortar. On its northern side is a huge water tank, used by pilgrims in ancient times to purify themselves before entering the sacred temple precinct. Inside the temple are some highly ornate colonnades surrounding a central shrine decorated with sculptures and colorful paintings. A short distance from the temple, along the banks of the Tungabhadra river, flocks of pilgrims still use the waters of the river to bathe and wash their clothes in a colorful procession. The Great Bazaar Street, once filled with the voices of thousands of merchants and street vendors, is now mostly silent. At the end of the 1 kilometer long Bazaar Street begins a granite stairway leading towards Matanga Hill and the great Achyutaraya temple. The stairway itself is flanked by numerous ruined pavilions, including one containing a colossal Nandi bull statue, carved from a single granite boulder, measuring over 5 meters long by 3 meters tall. Passing a few smaller ruined shrines, a narrow path leads into the spacious enclosure of the Achyutaraya temple. This enormous complex was built in 1534 by the Vijayanagara king Rama Raya and dedicated to Lord Shiva. Although in a ruined state, it contains all the classic elements of the Vijayanagara temple, including a walled enclosure, a pillared hall serving as a festival pavilion, and an inner enclosure containing the main shrine. Two huge entrance towers, or gopuras, lead into the temple's enclosure. Built entirely of granite, these massive entrance gateways into the temple precinct possess a complex decoration with niches, half-pillars, and diminutive shrines. The main sanctuary contains more beautiful sculptures on the pillars of the mandapa, facing a small Nandi shrine that once housed a statue of the Nandi bull. Like all the other great religious complexes of the ancient city, the Achyutaraya temple faces its own bazaar street. The huge avenue running north towards the river is flanked by colonnades on both sides, measuring nearly 40 meters wide with a length of over 500 meters. Behind the western colonnade can be seen a large but decaying rectangular ceremonial pool with a small pavilion in the middle. At the end of the bazaar street, near the river, are several smaller shrines in various stages of ruin and dilapidation. Upon reaching a small temple by the river, the street veers west, in the direction of the Virupaksha temple complex. Some ancient and much worn granite steps lead down to the Tungabhadra river, at the site of one of the ancient city's main river ports, where for a few dollars it is possible to rent a coracle to explore some of the numerous ruins scattered on the opposite banks of the river. These round cane boats are the direct descendants of some of the earliest boat prototypes in use over large parts of Asia and the European continent, including Mesopotamia, since Neolithic times. The The river banks are disseminated with ancient ruins and small shrines, as well as a great quantity of rock carvings and bas-reliefs, carved from some huge granite boulders. This whole area was used in ancient times as a quarry, from which the huge granite stone blocks used in the construction of the city's temples and palaces were extracted and carved. Continuing our ride on the opposite bank of the river, we reached the site of an ancient ruined bridge, of which only some of the stone posts remain. This stone bridge, once nearly 200 meters long, once connected the sacred center of the city near the Vittala temple complex with the neighborhood of Anegondi, located across the river. Near the landing is a huge stepped granite platform, supporting a large but much dilapidated temple. The temple contains an elegant pillared hall, now at risk of collapse, with a shrine and antechamber now entirely empty and inhabited only by a colony of bats. Returning to the end of the bazaar street, a narrow rock path leads to the summit of Matanga Hill, which affords spectacular views of the ancient city below. Clearly visible is the Virupaksha Bazaar Street, with the great temple towers at the far end, and the Achyutaraya temple complex and bazaar, with some magnificent views of the Tungabhadra river and its incredible rock formations. A small temple occupies the summit of the hill, being one of the most popular destinations for watching the sunset over the ancient city. The Vittala temple complex, located to the east of the sacred center, is perhaps the most famous of Hampi's ancient monuments. Set against a striking landscape of enormous granite boulders created by millions of years of erosion, the Vittala temple is a historical enigma, since nothing is known of the circumstances of its construction. The vast temple complex was clearly rebuilt and expanded several times by generations of Vijayanagara kings, but its exact origins are shrouded in mystery, as well as the identity of its builders. The temple stands in a vast rectangular enclosure with entrance towers or gopuras on three sides. The outer walls are decorated in typical Vijayanagara style, with an alternation of pillars and niches framed by ornate floral decorations, with a long inscription running on the cornice along the base of the wall. The entrance mandapa is perhaps the most beautiful part of this temple. The structure is raised on an ornate basement with delicate relief carvings showing processions of horsemen and figures dressed in European style. Above the pediment, huge monolithic pillars carved entirely out of granite support the roof of the mandapa, each pillar having been individually carved and hollowed out to create dozens of elegant colonnades surrounding the central shaft, which give the massive pillars a particularly elegant and light appearance. These colonnades, a common feature in Vijayanagara temple architecture, emit a specific musical tone when tapped lightly. The interior of the temple consists of 4 large colonnade halls. Massive brackets and beams support the roof, composed, like everything else, of solid granite slabs, some of which with spans of more than 10 meters. The innermost sanctuary shows evidence of at least 2 epochs of construction, and incorporates an earlier shrine with a circumambulatory passage. Immediately in front of the temple stands a huge stone chariot, with 2 pairs of rotating stone wheels on each side. The upper part of the chariot is monolithic and was carved from a single block of granite weighing in the tens of tons. Behind these, on the north side, stands a perfectly symmetrical pavilion with outer piers carved with the representation of Yalis, a mythical animal combining elements of a horse, an elephant, and a lion. The basement is also decorated with delicate representations of dancers and musicians. On the opposite end of the courtyard stands another pavilion, known as the 100-columned hall. This is a similarly designed structure, particularly notable for its beautifully preserved stone ceilings and ornate pillars. Of particular interest is the construction system of the outer walls. The enormous granite blocks are in fact no more than 20 or 30 centimeters thick, hiding a core of bricks. Exiting the Vittala temple complex to the north, a colonnade street takes to another walled enclosure entered by a towerless gopura decorated with Yali sculptures and Ramayana scenes. Almost nothing is known of this ruined temple, which stands today in splendid isolation. The interior is much ruined, but is notable for the very fine quality of its stonework and the enormous size of the blocks, some over 8 meters long. All around are more ruined structures in various stages of decay, of what was once one of the principal quarters of Vijayanagara's sacred center. A particularly striking group of monuments is found near what is called the King's Balance, standing between the Vittala and the Krishna temple. A ruined stone gateway separates the neighborhood of Vittalapura from the rest of the city down to the banks of the Tungabhadra river. There may be found more ruined temples built directly on the cliff face and containing some interesting carvings. The last important structure in the city's sacred center is the Krishna temple. This is another huge walled enclosure entered through a massive Gopura tower, which proclaims the royal nature of the temple. It was built in 1515 by Krishna Devaraja, perhaps the most famous of Vijayanagara's kings, to commemorate his victory over the Gajapati rulers of Orissa. Some remnants of plaster sculptures depicting battle scenes on the incomplete brick tower may refer to this king's victorious campaigns. The temple itself is one of the finest examples of Vijayanagara architecture and contains a beautiful colonnade mandapa supported by rows of elegantly sculptured pillars. Near the temple is a colossal statue of Narasimha, the lion incarnation of Vishnu, carved from a single giant granite boulder, next to which stands a similarly colossal 3 meters tall lingam on a circular pedestal. From the Krishna temple, another colonnade street leads across the rocky terrain to the royal center of the ancient city. The royal center presents itself as a series of large walled compounds, now containing mostly ruined structures, all that is left of various royal palaces and reception halls. The Lotus Mahal is probably the best preserved structure inside the royal center, and probably served as a two-story council chamber. Another large domed structure nearby belongs to the latest period of Vijayanagara and reflects Muslim and Persian influences. The great elephant stables immediately outside of the royal enclosure are the largest and most recognizable structure in the royal center, standing in front of a large plaza which served as a parade ground for troops and animals. The stables comprise a line of 11 domed chambers, each one of which could accommodate 2 elephants. Following the walls, past the noblemen's quarters, an unpaved road leads to the Hazara Rama, or Thousand Rama's temple. Originally consecrated to Rama by the king Devaraja I, it served as a royal chapel for the Vijayanagara kings and dates mostly to the early part of the 15th century. The temple's outer walls are massively built of granite and covered entirely with delicate bas-reliefs depicting processions of elephants, horses, and military contingents, accompanied by musicians and dancers. The temple compound is entered from the east, with an entrance gateway leading into a small open-air courtyard nearly completely occupied by structures. The main temple is approached through a colonnade porch, which was added in the 16th century, and is beautifully decorated on the outside with fine relief carvings depicting scenes from the Ramayana national epic. A total of 108 scenes proceed in a clockwise direction around the walls of the square mandapa, framed by elegantly ornate pilasters and other floral decorations. In contrast with the sculptural profusion of the exterior, the temple's interior is quite austere, with the exception of 4 extraordinarily carved pillars representing the 24 aspects of Vishnu. These pillars, made from dolerite, an extremely hard and untractable stone, were likely brought to Vijayanagara as a spoil of war from some other distant place, since the rock is not native of Karnataka. They are remarkable for their intricate decoration and the almost mirror-like polish. The outer walls of the enclosure are also decorated on the inside with various mythological scenes. They are built of enormous granite stone blocks, some over 5 to 6 meters long, still showing the knobs or protrusions used for their transportation. A dense pavilion with ornate pillars delimits the compound on its farthest end. Leaving the Hazara Rama temple, one is taken again through a series of ruined structures to another walled enclosure containing the remnants of the royal palace and audience halls. Immediately outside the enclosure is a huge monolithic trough, nearly 20 meters long, and a set of similarly monolithic doors which likely belonged to one of the royal palaces. A most curious object is what appears to be part of a huge stone lathe, with grooves produced by a rotating stone disc. Entering the enclosure, a beautiful step well fed by an aqueduct with monolithic sections would have once fed the gardens of the royal palace. Dominating the entire enclosure is a massive pyramidal structure covered with fine bas-reliefs, which once supported a colonnade audience hall. The relief carvings on the walls of the platform are carved in a rudimentary but vigorous style that is unique in the art of Vijayanagara. A stairway on the south side, flanked by elephant balustrades, leads to the top of the pyramidal platform, which affords beautiful views of the entire enclosure. This magnificent platform was partly dismantled in the final years of the Vijayanagara Empire for the construction of defensive walls and other structures within the royal center. Completing our tour of the royal center is a large octagonal fountain containing a pool with a central island platform, which was likely part of one of the royal palaces. The nearby Queen's Bath is another important structure. Its severe exterior contrasts sharply with the ornate interior, decorated with balconies and arched windows, providing privacy and discretion away from the prying eyes of outsiders. A short distance outside of the royal center stands one of Hampi's most mysterious buildings. Called the underground Shiva temple because of its location below the modern ground level, this temple may be one of the earliest structures at Vijayanagara. Past a relatively plain gopura, likely a 15th century addition, one enters through a labyrinth of gloomy and partially flooded subterranean chambers and passageways, forming a somehow confusing labyrinth around a central pillared hall. The dark interior is extremely austere and almost devoid of decoration, conveying an impression of great antiquity to the whole structure, while the huge granite blocks of the walls and ceiling almost evoke the image of the Osirian of Abydos and certain megalithic Egyptian temples. To the east of the royal center lie the ruins of several smaller temples. Among them, the Chandrasekhara temple stands in an enclosure, entered by a monumental gate still retaining part of its stucco decorations. This temple is a fine example of the late Vijayanagara style, possessing a beautiful colonnade porch, a square mandapa, and a sanctuary with a brick pyramidal tower. Here again we can see how the enclosure wall, in spite of its massive appearance, is in fact only covered in granite, hiding a brick masonry core. The temple proper is entered through a beautifully ornate doorway, leading into a spacious but rather austere pillared chamber and an empty sanctuary. Farther along stands yet another group of small but beautifully decorated temples. These small temples are nowadays in a quite ruinous state, outside of the major tourist routes of the site. Partly because of that, they still hold a particular charm, giving out more than any other structure a sense of the faded glory of this ancient city. We then head further east, passing through one of the many ancient gates that once led into the city. The enormous granite walls appear to be of an antiquity far greater than the rest of the ruins, being constructed of huge, perfectly interlocking stone blocks laid without cement or mortar. Located just outside of the city gates, the Patabhirama temple is an enormous complex besides the road leading east to Kamalapura. Dedicated to Rama, it once formed part of a now vanished suburban quarter. In spite of this temple's enormous size, no inscriptions allow to attribute its construction to any particular king or queen. The temple itself consists of the standard sequence of an open colonnade porch, a square mandapa, and a sanctuary surrounded by a circumambulatory passage. Completing the temple complex is a huge, well-preserved entrance gopura and a festival hall built up to the south of the spacious but now largely empty enclosure. The temple porch is supported by elegant columns decorated with yali sculptures. The enclosed mandapa has a similar structure, consisting of a large colonnade hall with a doorway at the far end leading into a now empty sanctuary. Of particular interest are the side galleries that surround and completely enclose the sanctuary, suggesting once again that the present temple likely incorporates an earlier structure of similar ground plan. The tour continues towards Matanga Hill with its well-preserved Raghunatha temple. This vast temple is contained like any other within its own walled enclosure, which is entered by a large and beautifully preserved gopura tower, containing some exquisite carvings. The temple proper sits in the center of the enclosure and is still an active place of worship and pilgrimage, owing to a giant image of Rama and his wife Sita with the monkey god Hanuman, carved from one giant granite boulder inside the temple's sanctuary. Numerous smaller sanctuaries and pavilions complement the enclosure. In one corner, we encounter yet another couple of strange granite stone blocks that appear to have been part of a lathe, as evidenced by the parallel circular grooves visible on the stone's surface. A central peg appears to be missing from the two stone blocks. Outside of the temple and past the enclosure wall, the view spans the entire breadth of the Tungabhadra river valley and some enormous granite boulders stacked perilously on top of each other. Of particular interest is a narrow crevice surrounded by carvings of lingas and images of the Nandi bull. On the temple walls are carved the numerous images of aquatic animals, which may be connected with legends of the flood and the belief that the waters drained through the crevice outside of the temple's enclosure. All around Hampi are found dozens more temples and rock sculptures, testifying to the size and prosperity of the ancient city of Vijayanagara. Some of these temples are found along the main entrance ways into Hampi, just besides the modern road, and are immediately recognizable by their brightly painted stone towers. One example is the great Anantashayana temple, erected by the king Krishna Devaraja on the road to Hospet as a cenotaph for his son. This huge temple, located within a walled enclosure with 3 ruined gopuras or entrance towers, had its own step well and a large sanctuary covered by an unusual elliptical dome instead of the customary tower. Here too we find among the rubble one of the strange stone lakes that we observed in many other parts of the ancient city. The ruins of Hampi are the largest in South India and testify to the prosperity and splendor of the last great medieval Indian empire. In less than 3 centuries, Hampi went from a small village on the banks of the Tungabhadra river to becoming the capital of an empire, stretching from the Gulf of Bengal to the Arabian Sea. One of the largest cities in the world, home to nearly 1 million people at its peak, it became a victim of the failed ambitions of its kings. The city of 1,000 years crumbled and faded into oblivion in less than a generation, returning once again to the small village of its origins. Decades of archaeological research have barely lifted the veil on the reasons why this particular site was chosen for the ephemeral capital of the Vijayanagara Empire. Perhaps the answer lies in the vast megalithic ruins and subterranean temples that appear to predate Hampi's great monumental flourishing in the 14th and 15th centuries of our era. These huge megalithic structures bear evidence to a long building tradition that exploited an abundance of readily available stone in the area and which the Vijayanagara kings tried to appropriate and imitate. The imitation and appropriation of earlier structures by the Vijayanagara kings is particularly evident in some of the later temple walls, where the enormous stone blocks turn out to be merely a facade, just a few inches thick, covering a simple brick core. This allowed for the construction of enormous temples in a relatively short period of time, but is also the reason why so many of the city's later structures did not withstand the test of time, as well as the earlier ones. There is then the tantalizing evidence of ancient technology in the form of the numerous stone lathes found scattered throughout the site. We cannot know for sure if they belong to the Vijayanagara period or if they are in fact a legacy from a much earlier time and culture. The ruins of Hampi Vijayanagara stand as a silent memorial to one of the last great megalithic building projects before the age of bricks and cement, and may still teach us important clues as to how similar buildings were erected in other parts of the world, from Egypt to Peru.